Unit 2, Presentation 2, the timeline of parole hearings. The first thing to note about parole hearings is you don't have to apply for one. Almost anyone with a sentence of 6 months or more will automatically receive a parole hearing. The minor exceptions to that rule are people with a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, and then a couple of other sentences that have been carved out. There are some firearms offences, for example, that don't come with the possibility of parole. If you are going to have a parole hearing, it's possible to refuse it, but if you do refuse it and you later change your mind, you have to write to the Parole Commission in order to get back into the system. Notification of parole hearings. The case manager should be keeping a person informed on 3 key dates. Those are parole eligibility, administrative reviews, and target hearing dates. Administrative review is sometimes referred to as a file review or a paper review. It is not the same thing as a parole hearing. It is conducted at the Parole Commission every 5 years until a person reaches parole eligibility. It is a mechanism through which a person's parole file is checked at specific intervals ahead of them becoming eligible for parole. And it's a process by which, if there were information missing from the file or if there were any issues with the trajectory that the person was on, these would be identified ahead of time. So if a person's case manager tells them that they have an administrative review coming up at a certain point in time, that is not to be confused with being told that there is a parole hearing happening. If a person is at all in doubt about that, they should ask their case manager to clarify which kind of event they're referring to. A target hearing date, that is usually given a little ways out, 2 years, even 3 years out, but it will only be given in the form of a month and a year. So a person might be told, you are going to have a parole hearing in November 2022, for example. It's not until much closer to the time that the actual specific date and time will be known. Whereas the case manager keeps the person informed of parole eligibility, administrative reviews, and target hearing dates, it's the responsibility of the Parole Commission itself to provide the actual notice of an upcoming hearing, and that notice will be served on a person by an institutional parole agent, and there will be 3 pieces of information included in it. The first is the date, time and place of the hearing. The second is the factors which the Commission considers in making a determination. And the third is the right of the inmate or a representative of the inmate to inspect the institutional file. Now, the regulations provide that a person should receive at least 15 days' notice of an upcoming parole hearing, unless there is good cause for not having been informed within that time frame. If a person was called to attend a parole hearing without having had that 15 days notice, and they don't feel that they are ready and prepared to go ahead, they should inform the commissioners or the hearing officers conducting the hearing, and it ought to be rescheduled. The timing of parole hearings. As we have previously noted, parole eligibility arises halfway through a sentence for violent crimes and a quarter way through a sentence for non-violent crimes. Parole eligibility is the point in time that someone enters into the zone of the phase of the sentence in which they could potentially be paroled. Then there's a difference in terms of when the first hearing happens. If the sentence is less than 5 years, the first hearing happens as soon as administratively possible. So that could happen really, really quickly. Perhaps if it was for a non-violent crime, then it could happen as early as 6 months after the person has been incarcerated. So that might even be while they're still in the jail and haven't been moved to prison, or if they have a shorter sentence, they might not even be going all the way to a prison. So there isn't as much time for the parole hearing preparation at that point in time, but the argument in favour of having that first hearing as soon as administratively possible is that the person can be given guidance by the Parole Commission as to what they should do to line themselves up to be ready for release when they do reach parole eligibility, and the next parole hearing would come before that. Now, for sentences with more than 5 years, the first hearing happens about 6 months before parole eligibility is reached. This slide just shows how parole relates to a sentence. Recall that this middle section here is the zone that parole could happen in. So a violent offence, that zone begins about halfway through. Non-violent offence, it begins about a quarter way through. Administrative reviews would happen before parole eligibility, and target hearing dates for sentences of 5 years or more. The first one will happen about 6 months before parole eligibility is reached, and for sentences of 5 years or less, then it will happen as soon as administratively possible, which could be really quite early in the sentence. Now, there are two different avenues for parole hearings depending upon the kind of offence that is being dealt with. If it is someone who has a life sentence, or if there was a death in their charge, so any kind of a homicide, then their hearing will be heard by 2 parole commissioners, so 2 members of the 10-person parole commission. For anything else, the parole hearing will be heard by 1 hearing officer. Recall that a hearing officer is an employee of the Parole Commission, not a member of the Parole Commission. So this is what it looks like if you go before a hearing officer. So we start up here. The hearing officer makes a recommendation. It's only a recommendation because they're not a member of the Parole Commission, so they can't actually make the decision. So the hearing officer who sees the person, conducts the hearing, makes a recommendation. They then, that gets passed to a parole commissioner to review the recommendation. That will happen by paper. That happens at the Parole Commission. It doesn't happen in front of the person, although the hearing officer will have told the person at their hearing what the recommendation is going to be. If you go before a hearing officer, there is an opportunity to do what's called filing an exception. That's basically like appealing the recommendation, but the wording is file an exception because it's not really an appeal against their decision, because their decision has to be reviewed by a parole commissioner anyway. So it's really just an opportunity for the offender to say, hey, while you're reviewing the hearing officer's recommendation, please bear in mind that I disagree with it. If the commissioner agrees with the hearing officer and the person who's going to be paroled or wants to be paroled doesn't file an exception, it goes straight to a decision being issued. If, however, either the hearing officer doesn't agree with the recommendation or the person files an exception, or both of those things, then it will go to an appellate panel of 2 commissioners to make a decision, and then a third one is added if the 2 of them can't agree, and then it just goes by decision of the majority, and then the decision is issued. This is the situation for someone who goes before 2 parole commissioners, but they don't have a life sentence. And they just go before the 2 parole commissioners and the decision is issued. See, there's no opportunity there for filing an exception because those 2 parole commissioners have the power to make that decision. And then finally, this is the hearing before 2 parole commissioners where the person has a life sentence, and now you're bringing the governor into the equation. So you go before the 2 parole commissioners. If they're open to the person being paroled, then that hearing is put on hold. If they're not open to the person being paroled at that point in time, then that's that for now. If it's put on hold, the person then undergoes a psychological evaluation. At the moment, that means being moved to the Tucson institution, and there has traditionally been quite a long wait list, 1 year, sometimes up to 2 years between the decision being put on hold and the psychological evaluation being completed. Once that's completed, the results go back to the Parole Commission, who sit en banc. So all 10 commissioners meet to review the psychological evaluation. At the moment, if any one of them, so any less than the 10 agree, then that's the end at that point in time for that person's bid for parole. If, however, all 10 do agree, then they can recommend that person to the governor for parole, and the file is sent up to the governor's desk. And in most cases, the governor has the opportunity to approve it or to disapprove it, or to just let it sit there for 6 months. If he lets it sit there for 6 months and doesn't disapprove it, then at the end of that time period, then the Parole Commission's recommendation will stand and the person will get parole.
Role of the case manager. The case manager has an important role to play in parole hearings, although it's not something that you'll find set out in full detail in the regulations. First of all, they keep the person informed about parole eligibility and target hearing dates and the like. Secondly, though, they prepare the pre-parole summary to include the computer-generated risk assessment score. So this is once the list gets sent out to the institutions of who's going to go up for parole hearings, case managers then put together a summary and they run the risk assessment tool that comes up with the score that the person's at. Remember, that score might have changed since the person first went into prison. They also put together a summary of everything the person's done. They then make a recommendation to the Parole Commission as to what they think should happen with parole. And they meet with the person ahead of the hearing to go over the institutional file. And then they're the person who attends the parole hearing, and they have the institutional file with them at the parole hearing in case the commissioners have any questions. Always bear in mind, you do have a legal right to view your own file or to elect a representative to view that file. Engaging with the case manager is an important piece of parole hearing preparation. First of all, if you are someone who's going to be facing a parole hearing, it is really good to stay on good terms with your case manager. I know people don't pick their own case managers. Oftentimes it's based on alphabet of your last name determines who your case manager is. But trying to nurture that relationship is important because that case manager does have the opportunity to make a recommendation to the Parole Commission. Secondly, be absolutely sure to take the opportunity to go over the institutional file with the case manager ahead of the hearing, and if the parole packet is done by then, or even if it's partially done, bring that with you to that meeting to try and make sure that the two things match up with each other. As a parole advocate, you should write to the case manager to introduce yourselves. And a parole advocate could also be a representative who the person nominates to go over the institutional file. So that could be coordinated as well.